A millionaire found a girl lost in the forest and took her to her grandmother's house, who has a disability. When he returned home and entered in without knocking on the door, he was struck by the scene he saw. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. The forest was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant call of a bird. Rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of light that danced on the ground. Among the serene beauty, a soft sound broke the stillness, a muffled sob. A girl no older than 9 sat huddled beneath a large oak tree. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and her tiny shoulders quivered with each sob. Her tear-streaked face, framed by unruly curls, was a picture of fear and vulnerability. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and her clothes were tattered, as if she'd been wandering for days. She clutched a small, worn doll tightly in her arms, her only comfort in an otherwise terrifying ordeal. Nearby, a man in his late 30s stepped carefully over the roots and undergrowth. Dressed in a crisp, tailored suit and holding a leather briefcase, he looked wholly out of place in this untamed setting. His name was Daniel Armitage, a millionaire known for his cold demeanor and razor-sharp business acumen. He was hiking that day, a rare break from his work, to clear his mind. But the sight of the crying child stopped him in his tracks. For a moment he hesitated. Compassion wasn't a strength he claimed to possess. Yet, something in the girl's tearful eyes called out to him, stirring an unfamiliar ache in his chest. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice gentler than he intended. The girl flinched at the sound, shrinking further into herself. "I'm lost," she whispered, her words barely audible over her sobs. Her voice trembled with raw fear. Daniel knelt down, setting his briefcase aside. He didn't know what compelled him to stay, but he couldn't just walk away. "What's your name?" he asked softly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Lila," she murmured, peeking up at him with wide, teary eyes. "I was looking for my grandma's house, but I don't know where I am." His heart clenched. Her vulnerability was undeniable. He took a deep breath and said, "Don't worry, Lila. I'll help you find her." As she gazed at him with fragile hope, Daniel realized he'd just committed to something far outside his comfort zone. Daniel Armitage was a man who had everything, or so the world believed. With a sprawling mansion overlooking the city, a fleet of luxury cars, and a portfolio of successful businesses, he was the epitome of wealth and power. Yet, beneath the polished surface of his life, Daniel harbored a loneliness so deep it often felt like a shadow trailing him everywhere. Growing up in a modest household, Daniel had learned early that the world valued success above all else. After his parents' death in a car accident when he was in college, he had thrown himself into building his empire. The pain of loss became the fuel for his ambition. As the years passed, he rose to prominence, gaining accolades, respect, and of course immense wealth. But as his bank account grew, so did the chasm of emptiness within him. His mansion, though grand and filled with priceless art and opulent furnishings, was silent. No laughter echoed through its halls, no voices called out his name with warmth or love. He had neither friends nor family to share his triumphs, or his failures with. Instead, he spent his evenings alone, sipping expensive whiskey and staring out at the glittering skyline, wondering if this was all there was to life. Daniel had tried relationships once or twice, but his relentless pursuit of success always came first. When love required vulnerability, he found himself incapable of offering it. Vulnerability felt too much like weakness, and Daniel Armitage could not afford to appear weak. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. He could solve any problem in the boardroom, yet he was powerless to fill the void in his soul. His life, for all its luxury, was little more than a series of empty routines. That morning, he had ventured into the forest to escape the suffocating monotony of his days. He told himself it was for exercise, for a change of scenery, but deep down he was searching for something he couldn't name. And then he saw her, the little girl alone under the tree. Her fragile, tearful presence stirred something within him that no deal, no acquisition, had ever managed to touch. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the faintest flicker of purpose. Daniel crouched to her level, keeping his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her further. Lila's eyes darted between him and the surrounding forest, her tiny hands clutching the doll as if it were her lifeline. "Lila," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I know you're scared, but I promise you're not alone anymore. Can you tell me how you got lost?" She sniffled and hesitated, her lower lip trembling. "I was with my grandma. She's sick, so she sent me to get berries from the edge of the forest. But I couldn't find my way back." Her voice broke and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "What if I never find her? She needs me." Daniel felt a pang in his chest. The girl's earnestness and concern for her grandmother were heart-wrenching. "We'll find her," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he fully considered the logistics. "Do you remember anything about the way to her house? Landmarks, a path?" She shook her head miserably. "I don't know. It's small, and there's a garden with flowers by the door." He nodded, filing the information away. The forest was vast, and finding one small house wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her here or abandon her to someone else's care. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "I don't know," she murmured, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "It feels like forever." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to her. "Here, use this." She stared at it, then at him, as though unsure whether to trust him. Slowly, she accepted it, dabbing at her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do you feel strong enough to walk with me?" Daniel asked, glancing at the uneven forest floor. "We'll stick together, and I'll make sure nothing happens to you." Lila nodded cautiously, her small hand gripping the doll tighter. Tentatively, she reached out and took his outstretched hand. It was cold and fragile against his, but her grip tightened, as if finding courage in the connection. "Let's go," Daniel said softly. "We'll find your grandmother." As they began their uncertain journey through the forest, Daniel couldn't help but feel a strange protectiveness for this small, scared child. She had no one else at this moment, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he felt it was his responsibility to help her. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly as Daniel and Lila trudged along its uneven paths. The trees towered above them, their canopies filtering sunlight into a soft green glow. The air was cool and filled with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. As they walked, Lila's initial shyness began to fade, and she spoke in small, tentative bursts, her voice carrying a mixture of innocence and longing. "My grandma's the best," she said, her steps growing a little more confident as she clung to Daniel's hand. "Even though her legs don't work like they used to, she still does everything for me. She says I'm her sunshine." Daniel glanced down at her, surprised by the warmth in her words. "She must love you a lot." Lila nodded, a faint smile flickering across her face. "She says I'm all she has." "My parents," her voice trailed off, her gaze dropping to the ground. "They went to heaven a long time ago." A lump formed in Daniel's throat. He understood loss all too well. "That must have been hard for you." "It was," she admitted softly. "But Grandma says we're strong together. She always makes me feel safe." The simplicity of her statement stirred something inside him. This child had so little, yet she seemed to have a strength that Daniel himself lacked. As they continued walking, she told him more about her grandmother, how she used to sew dresses when she was younger, how she loved roses and had planted a small patch in front of their house. Each detail painted a picture of a life far removed from Daniel's own, a life defined by love and resilience, even in the face of hardship. Lila occasionally stumbled on roots or uneven ground, and each time Daniel steadied her, his patience surprising even himself. As they passed a stream, she stopped to kneel by the water, cupping her hands to take a drink. He waited, watching her with a mix of awe and quiet contemplation. "Do you think she's okay?" Lila asked suddenly, standing up and brushing her hands on her dress. "I think she's worried about you," Daniel replied honestly. And I think she'll be so happy to see you. Lila gave him a hopeful smile, her trust in him growing. They walked on, the forest feeling less imposing as their bond deepened with every step. The forest began to thin as they approached the edge of a clearing. Lila's excitement was palpable. Her steps quickened and she tugged on Daniel's hand. "We're close," she said, her voice brimming with hope. "I can feel it." Daniel scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of a house. Then, amidst the wild undergrowth and scattered trees, he saw it, a small, weathered cottage with a sagging roof and faded paint. The modest structure stood as a quiet testament to resilience, with a patch of roses blooming defiantly in front. It was as if the flowers, too, refused to yield to the struggles of time. "That's it!" Lila cried, releasing his hand and sprinting toward the house. She nearly tripped over the uneven ground but caught herself, driven by pure determination. Daniel followed at a slower pace, taking in the scene. As he approached the porch, the door creaked open, and a frail woman in a wheelchair appeared in the doorway. Her hair was a snowy white, tied back neatly, and her face was lined with years of worry and wisdom. When her eyes landed on Lila, they filled with relief and tears. "Lila!" the grandmother exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Grandma!" Lila flung herself into the woman's waiting arms, burying her face against her chest. For a long moment they held each other, their love an unspoken force that seemed to radiate from them. Daniel stood back, giving them space but unable to tear his gaze away. The scene struck a deep chord in him. The connection between them was so raw, so real, that it made him acutely aware of what he lacked in his own life. After a few minutes, the grandmother looked up, noticing Daniel for the first time. Her expression shifted to cautious gratitude. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm Daniel," he said, his tone polite but warm. "I found Lila in the forest. She was lost, and I helped her find her way back." The grandmother's face softened. "Thank you," she said quietly, her hands gently stroking Lila's hair. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "There's no need," Daniel replied. "I'm just glad she's safe." As he stood there, watching the bond between grandmother and granddaughter, he realized that this moment, a simple reunion, held more beauty and meaning than anything his wealth had ever brought him. The warm reunion between Lila and her grandmother lingered in Daniel's mind as he turned to leave the modest cottage. He paused at the threshold, watching as the grandmother guided Lila into the house. Despite the wheelchair, her movements were steady, her determination evident. "Wait," Lila called out, her small voice pulling him back. She hurried to his side, her doll tucked under one arm. "Are you going to leave already?" Daniel crouched down, meeting her worried gaze. "You're home now, Lila. You're safe. That's what matters." But she hesitated, looking toward her grandmother, who watched the exchange silently. "I wanted to say thank you for helping me. Grandma always says we should thank people who are kind." Daniel managed a small smile. "You're welcome, Lila. You're very brave, you know that." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, and she clutched her doll tighter. "Will I see you again?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. His life was a world apart from theirs, a world of sterile luxury and empty routines. Yet, something about the way she looked at him made him wonder if he truly wanted to return to that life, unchanged. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "But I'm glad I met you." Lila smiled shyly before retreating back to her grandmother's side. The elderly woman gave Daniel a grateful nod, her eyes conveying a depth of emotion words couldn't capture. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady but filled with feeling. "Not many would do what you did." Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond. He stepped off the porch and walked toward his car, which was parked haphazardly along the forest's edge. The afternoon sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. As he started the engine and drove away, he couldn't shake the image of the little girl's hopeful eyes or the way the grandmother's frail hands had held her so protectively. The simplicity of their love stood in stark contrast to the emptiness of his mansion waiting for him. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Daniel's thoughts had grown heavier. The silence of his opulent home greeted him like an old foe, amplifying the hollowness inside him. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning whether his life had any true meaning. Daniel entered his sprawling mansion, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the marble floors and vaulted ceilings. The sheer size of the home, meant to exude power and grandeur, now felt suffocatingly empty. He set his keys and briefcase on the sleek mahogany table near the entrance and moved toward the living room, pulling off his jacket as he went. As he rounded the corner, he stopped abruptly. The sight before him was unexpected. His housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, was seated on the grand sofa with a group of staff gathered around her. The typically reserved woman was laughing, her face illuminated with a warmth he had never seen before. Beside her, the gardener, a stout man in his 60s, was telling a story that had everyone in stitches. Even the usually stoic butler was leaning against the fireplace, a rare smile playing on his lips. On the coffee table sat a modest cake, its uneven frosting hinting at a homemade effort. A single candle burned brightly in the middle. It took Daniel a moment to realize what he was witnessing. They were celebrating Mrs. Calloway's birthday. He remained in the shadows, watching as the group erupted in laughter once more. They were comfortable, connected, and unguarded, so unlike how they behaved in his presence. The warmth in the room was almost tangible, a stark contrast to the cold solitude he carried with him. The scene hit him like a wave. These were the same people who worked tirelessly to maintain his home, yet he had never considered their lives beyond their duties. He didn't know Mrs. Calloway had a birthday today, nor did he know that his staff shared moments like this when he wasn't around. For a brief moment, he felt like an intruder in his own house. He turned to leave quietly but accidentally knocked a vase off a side table. The crash startled the group, and all eyes turned to him. "Mr. Armitage!" Mrs. Calloway exclaimed, rising quickly from her seat. Her laughter vanished, replaced by the formal, subdued demeanor he was accustomed to. The others followed suit, stiffening like schoolchildren caught misbehaving. Daniel stared at them, unsure of what to say. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he finally managed, his voice sounding oddly distant. "It's nothing, sir," Mrs. Calloway said quickly, trying to clear the table. But the atmosphere in the room had already shifted, the warmth drained like water from a cracked vase. Daniel retreated to his study, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He sank into the leather chair by the window, staring blankly at the city lights twinkling in the distance. His mind replayed the scene he had just witnessed, the laughter and camaraderie among his staff contrasting sharply with the sudden tension that gripped the room the moment they saw him. Why did they stop? He wondered. It wasn't the interruption itself, it was him. His presence had transformed their joy into unease. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and running a hand through his hair. Daniel had always prided himself on maintaining a professional relationship with his staff, treating them with fairness and respect. But tonight, he realized he had been blind to the human connections that existed right under his nose. He didn't know anything about their lives beyond their roles in his carefully constructed world. The warmth in the room, the easy laughter, it had felt so alien to him, yet achingly familiar. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. The memory of Lila and her grandmother resurfaced, bringing a fresh wave of unease. Their home was humble and imperfect, yet filled with a love so genuine it left a mark on him. Daniel pushed back from his desk and stood, pacing the room. For years he had believed that success was measured in numbers: profits, assets, acquisitions. And yet, despite all the material wealth he had amassed, he couldn't shake the emptiness that gnawed at him. He thought of Lila's innocent trust in him and her fierce love for her grandmother. He thought of the grandmother's gratitude and quiet dignity despite her struggles. They had nothing compared to him, yet their lives seemed infinitely richer. The realization struck him like a thunderbolt. He had spent years chasing the wrong kind of wealth. His mansion, his cars, his empire, they were nothing more than a gilded cage. Daniel sat back down, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. For the first time in years, he felt something akin to shame. He had the power to make a difference, to connect, to help, yet he had done nothing with it. But that could change. Daniel's mind churned as he paced the length of his study. His reflection in the glass of the massive window looked back at him, distant and hollow, a man who had everything yet felt nothing. The memory of Lila's wide, hopeful eyes and her grandmother's quiet strength pulled at him like an unseen force. He glanced at the bookshelf across the room, lined with volumes on business strategy, personal growth, and success stories. None of them could offer what he was looking for now. His success had given him comfort, security, and power, but it hadn't given him connection. Finally, he stopped pacing and sat at his desk, grabbing a notepad. His hand hovered over the paper, unsure where to begin. Slowly he started making a list. Financial help for Lila and her grandmother. Medical assistance for the grandmother. Repairs or renovations to their house. As he wrote, the scope of what he wanted to do expanded. The house wasn't just in need of repairs. It deserved to be a safe and welcoming home for Lila to grow up in. Her grandmother, too, deserved more than just medical care. She needed comfort and ease in her twilight years. The next thought surprised him. He wanted to see them again. It wasn't enough to send money or arrange for assistance. He wanted to be there, to deliver these changes personally. He wasn't sure why, but the idea filled him with a quiet determination. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the list. It wasn't just about helping them. It was about filling the void in his own life. Lila and her grandmother had something he deeply envied. Love, connection, a sense of purpose. And though he didn't fully understand it, being near them felt like the first step toward something he had been missing for years. The next morning, Daniel called his assistant to arrange for supplies and professional help. His staff was puzzled but obedient as he gave detailed instructions about medical professionals, home improvement teams, and resources for education. When he hung up the phone, a strange mix of nerves and anticipation coursed through him. For the first time in years, Daniel felt alive, driven not by profit margins but by a genuine desire to make a difference. He was going back to the little cottage, and he couldn't wait. Daniel drove back to the forest, his car loaded with supplies and carefully chosen gifts. The vehicle, a sleek black SUV, seemed out of place as it rumbled along the dirt road leading to Lila's grandmother's house. Stopping just short of the clearing, Daniel stepped out, carrying a box filled with groceries, medical supplies, and a few surprises he hoped would make their lives easier. The cottage came into view, its humble charm untouched by the passage of a single day. Lila was outside, sitting cross-legged in the garden, carefully weaving tiny flower crowns from the roses she had picked. When she saw Daniel approaching, her face lit up like the sunrise. "Daniel!" she shouted, jumping to her feet and running toward him. He crouched just in time for her to throw her arms around his neck. Her exuberance startled him, but he found himself returning the hug, holding her small frame gently. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I promised I'd help, didn't I?" he replied, his voice warm. "And I don't break promises." Lila pulled back, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she noticed the box in his hands. "What's all that?" "Just a few things I thought you and your grandmother might need," he said, his tone casual, though he felt a nervous flutter in his chest. As they approached the cottage, the grandmother appeared in the doorway, her hands resting on the wheels of her chair. She eyed Daniel warily, her expression a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "Mr. Armitage," she greeted. "We weren't expecting you." "I wanted to stop by and bring a few things," Daniel said, placing the box on the porch. "Groceries, medicine, and maybe some tools for fixing things around here." The grandmother's eyes softened, though her tone remained cautious. "That's very kind of you. But I hope you're not doing this out of pity." Daniel met her gaze, his voice steady. "Not pity. Respect. I saw how much you and Lila mean to each other and I wanted to help. That's all. For a moment, the grandmother studied him, as if trying to read his soul. Finally she nodded. Come inside. The interior of the cottage was simple yet inviting, a stark contrast to Daniel's vast and cold mansion. Handmade curtains hung on the windows, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. It was humble, but it felt like a home, a place Daniel realized he had never truly known. Lila scurried around excitedly, helping Daniel unpack the box. Her giggles filled the room as she pulled out canned goods, fresh vegetables, and a few toys he had added at the last minute. Look, Grandma, she exclaimed, holding up a stuffed bear. Isn't it cute? The grandmother smiled softly, her gaze shifting to Daniel. You've done more than enough already. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Daniel replied, his tone sincere. This is the least I can do. Lila plopped down on the floor, hugging the stuffed bear, her happiness contagious. Daniel, can you stay for dinner? She asked, her eyes wide with hope. Caught off guard, he hesitated. I don't want to impose. Nonsense, the grandmother interjected. It's the least we can do. Besides, Lila seems to have taken quite a liking to you. Before he could protest further, Lila was pulling him toward the small kitchen table. Plates were laid out, and soon the grandmother served a modest but delicious meal. Homemade stew with bread. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, surprising Daniel. He found himself laughing at Lila's stories and listening intently as the grandmother shared bits of her life. Midway through dinner, Lila fetched her doll and announced that she wanted to put on a puppet show. Daniel watched, amused, as she made the doll talk in a high-pitched voice, telling a story about a brave knight who rescued a princess. She insisted that Daniel play the knight, and though he fumbled with the role, Lila's delighted laughter made it worth the effort. The grandmother watched from her chair, her expression softening as she saw Lila's joy. For the first time in years, the weight of her struggle seemed lighter. You've brought a lot of happiness here tonight, she said quietly to Daniel. Daniel looked at her, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Maybe it's time I stopped keeping all that happiness out of my own life. As the evening wore on, the cozy atmosphere of the cottage wrapped around Daniel like a comforting embrace. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, chattering away as she played with her new stuffed bear. Her innocent joy was infectious, but it was the quiet strength of her grandmother that left a lasting impression on Daniel. The older woman reclined in her wheelchair, knitting something with deft hands despite her frailty. She glanced up at Daniel, who sat across from her. His usually stoic demeanor softened by the simplicity of the moment. You've brought more than groceries tonight, she said quietly. You've given Lila something to smile about. And for that I'm grateful. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. I think I've gained more than I've given, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of his words. Being here, it's different. It feels real. The grandmother tilted her head, studying him with a knowing gaze. Real things don't always come easy, Mr. Armitage. They take work, sacrifice. But they're worth it. Her words struck a chord, echoing thoughts that had been simmering in Daniel's mind since the moment he found Lila in the forest. His life had been meticulously constructed. His empire, his fortune, but it lacked this sense of warmth and purpose. Watching Lila and her grandmother, he saw a richness that no amount of wealth could buy. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling a vulnerability he wasn't used to. I've spent so much of my life chasing success, he said, almost to himself. But now, looking at what you have here, it feels like I've been chasing the wrong things. The grandmother set down her knitting and looked at him with quiet compassion. Success isn't wrong, but it's not everything. You need people who care about you, who you care about in return. Otherwise, all the success in the world won't fill the emptiness. Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He glanced at Lila, who was now humming a tune as she tucked her bear into bed. Her innocence, her trust, they felt like gifts he didn't deserve but deeply cherished. I don't want to just walk away, he said finally, his voice steady. Not from Lila, not from you. I want to help. More than that, I want to be part of something like this. And in that moment, Daniel knew. His life was about to change. The next morning, Daniel returned to the cottage, carrying another box of supplies and a set of tools. He had barely knocked before Lila flung the door open, her face lighting up like a sunrise. You came back, she exclaimed, her delight infectious. I told you I would, Daniel said with a smile, stepping inside. I've got some things to fix around here. Do you think you can help me? Lila nodded vigorously, already bouncing on her toes in excitement. She turned to her grandmother, who was rolling into the room with her usual grace. Grandma, Daniel's going to fix stuff. Can I help? Her grandmother chuckled, her skepticism toward Daniel softening with each interaction. As long as you don't get in his way too much, she teased, casting a wary but grateful glance at Daniel. You're determined to be a handyman now, are you? Daniel grinned, setting the box on the table. Let's just say I've been living with plenty of broken things in my own life. Maybe fixing some of yours will be a good start. The day was spent repairing creaky hinges, patching up leaks, and reinforcing the rickety porch. Lila was his self-appointed assistant, handing him tools with a sense of importance that made him laugh. Meanwhile, her grandmother sat nearby, observing quietly but smiling more often than not. At one point, as Daniel hammered a loose board into place, the grandmother spoke. You don't have to do all this. We've managed just fine. I know, Daniel replied, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. But just managing isn't good enough. Not for Lila. Not for you. Her expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. Lila's all I have. I've been scared for so long that I wouldn't be enough for her. Daniel met her gaze, his voice steady. You've been more than enough. But maybe you don't have to do it all alone anymore. That evening, as they sat together for another simple meal, the grandmother spoke again. You're earning my trust, Daniel. But trust takes time. I understand, he said quietly. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind taking the time. As the sun began to set on another day spent at the cottage, Daniel found himself walking along the edge of the garden with Lila. She held his hand tightly, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm. The evening was cool, and the sky glowed with streaks of pink and gold, casting a warm light over the forest clearing. Daniel, Lila said suddenly, her voice small but curious. Why do you come here? Don't you have a big, fancy house to go back to? Her question caught him off guard. He looked down at her, seeing the innocence and curiosity in her eyes. I do have a big house, he admitted. But it's not really a home. Not like this place is for you and your grandmother. Lila tilted her head, frowning thoughtfully. It's just a house. No love in it. The simplicity of her words pierced him. Yeah, he said softly. No love in it. They walked a few more steps before Lila asked, Are you lonely? Daniel paused, his chest tightening. He crouched down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. I think I've been lonely for a long time. But meeting you and your grandma, it's helped me realize something. What's that? She asked, tilting her head with curiosity. That I don't have to be lonely anymore, he said with a gentle smile. And I want to help make sure you and your grandma aren't lonely either. Lila's face lit up, her joy uncontainable. Really? You mean it? Daniel nodded, his resolve strengthening. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind all day, but now, with Lila's hopeful eyes staring into his, it felt natural. I want to help you both. More than just fixing things around the house. I want to make sure you have everything you need. A better house, support for your grandma, and a future where you can grow up happy and safe. That evening, Daniel shared his plan with Lila's grandmother. He proposed a long-term arrangement, helping with medical care, providing a new, secure home, and ensuring Lila's education. Though her gratitude was evident, the grandmother hesitated. Why would you do all this for us? She asked, her voice cautious but not unkind. Daniel looked at her, his voice steady and sincere. "Because for the first time in my life, I want to do something that truly matters." The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Daniel began making arrangements to ensure Lila and her grandmother would have everything they needed for a better life. He hired contractors to renovate the cottage, planning to preserve its charm while making it safer and more comfortable. A team of medical professionals was called to assess the grandmother's condition, and with their recommendations, Daniel secured the best treatment options available. Lila was beside herself with excitement. She insisted on helping with every task, from selecting new curtains to supervising the workers as they repaired the porch. She even made drawings of what she thought the garden should look like, complete with a bigger rose patch and a tiny swing set. One morning, as Daniel watched Lila carefully planting new rose bushes in the front yard, her grandmother wheeled herself to his side. The older woman's face held a mix of gratitude and lingering doubt. "You've done so much for us," she began, her voice steady but cautious. "But I still don't understand why. You're a stranger to us, and yet you've turned our lives upside down in the best way. Why would you care so much?" Daniel turned to her, taking a moment to find the right words. "At first, I wasn't sure myself," he admitted. "But after meeting you and Lila, I saw something I've been missing in my life. A sense of purpose, of connection. I've spent so long chasing the wrong things, and this feels right. Helping you both, being here, it's helped me more than you realize." The grandmother studied him, her sharp eyes softened by understanding. "You're a good man, Daniel," she said finally. "I didn't think I'd trust anyone so quickly, but you've proven me wrong." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, the three of them gathered on the porch. Lila leaned against Daniel, clutching her stuffed bear, while her grandmother sat beside them, a blanket draped over her legs. "We're like a little family now, aren't we?" Lila said sleepily, her voice filled with quiet contentment. Daniel glanced at the grandmother, who smiled softly, and then back at Lila. "Yes," he said, his voice full of conviction. "We are." For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. A few weeks later, the renovations on the cottage were complete. The once ramshackle house now stood proudly, its fresh paint glistening in the sunlight. The rose garden had doubled in size, thanks to Lila's enthusiastic planting efforts, and a small swing set had been installed in the backyard. Inside, the cozy charm of the home remained, but modern touches made it more comfortable and accessible for the grandmother. Daniel was there to see it all finished. He had even insisted on driving Lila and her grandmother to the cottage himself after they spent a few days in temporary housing during the renovations. Lila squealed in delight when she saw the house, running from room to room, marveling at every little change. "It's like a fairy tale," she exclaimed, her wide eyes taking in the new kitchen and freshly polished floors. Her grandmother wheeled herself slowly through the house, her hands brushing against the smooth banisters and newly installed railings. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, a faint smile on her lips. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never dreamed I'd see anything like this." Daniel watched from the doorway, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar but welcome warmth. For the first time, the house didn't just feel like a shelter. It felt alive, filled with possibility and hope. Beyond the physical changes, Daniel had also taken steps to ensure long-term support for the family. He had set up a trust fund for Lila's education and arranged for a home care nurse to visit the grandmother regularly. But it wasn't just about providing resources. Daniel found himself spending more and more time with them, whether it was helping Lila with her schoolwork or sharing quiet conversations with her grandmother over tea. The mansion he once called home remained intact, but he rarely visited it. Instead, Daniel began to think of the little cottage at the edge of the forest as the place he truly belonged. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Lila looked up at Daniel and said, "You're like our guardian angel." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I think you and your grandma are mine." And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was truly home. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel's life became intertwined with Lila and her grandmother's in a way he hadn't anticipated. His mornings, once filled with monotonous meetings and endless calls, now started with the sound of Lila's laughter as she raced to greet him whenever he visited. His evenings were no longer spent in a cavernous, silent mansion but in the cozy warmth of the cottage, where conversations and shared meals filled the space with life. One evening, as the grandmother rested in her chair and Lila played with her stuffed bear near the fireplace, Daniel sat with a cup of tea in his hands, gazing into the flickering flames. The grandmother noticed his contemplative expression and wheeled herself closer. "You've changed," she said softly, her tone gentle but observant. Daniel looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I have," he admitted. "I spent so many years chasing things that I thought would make me happy. Success, wealth, power. But the more I had, the emptier I felt." The grandmother nodded, her wise eyes meeting his. "It's easy to confuse being busy with being fulfilled. But real fulfillment comes from giving and connecting, with others, with yourself." He set his cup down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I didn't realize how lonely I was until I met Lila. She's like this little light that shines no matter what. And you've been through so much, but you still carry so much strength." The grandmother smiled, her gaze shifting to Lila, who was now humming a soft tune as she played. "When you've lost as much as we have, you learn to hold on to the things that matter." Daniel followed her gaze, watching the little girl's carefree joy. "You've both given me something I didn't think I could have," he said quietly. "A sense of belonging, purpose." The grandmother placed a hand on his. "And you've given us more than we could have dreamed. But remember, Daniel, family isn't built in a day. It's something you create, day by day, with patience and love." As the fire crackled softly, Daniel felt the weight of her words. He knew this was only the beginning of the journey, and for the first time in his life, he was eager to embrace it. The first snowfall of the season blanketed the cottage in a soft layer of white, turning the forest into a winter wonderland. Lila danced in the front yard, her breath visible in the crisp air as she twirled with her arms outstretched. Daniel stood on the porch, watching her with a smile, a steaming cup of cocoa in his hand. Beside him, the grandmother was bundled in a thick shawl, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You spoil her, you know," the grandmother said, nodding toward the swing set Daniel had added to the yard, now draped with icicles. "She's going to think life's always this magical." Daniel chuckled. "Life should feel magical for a child, don't you think? There's enough time for her to learn about the harder parts." The grandmother hummed in agreement, her gaze softening as she watched Lila scoop up snow to form a small, lopsided ball. "She deserves it," she said quietly. "We both do." Lila suddenly stopped her play and bounded up the porch steps, her cheeks rosy with excitement. "Daniel," she exclaimed, "come help me make a snowman." Daniel set his cup down and ruffled her hair. "All right, but only if you promise not to pelt me with snowballs while I'm working." Lila giggled and grabbed his hand, pulling him eagerly toward the yard. The grandmother watched them with a smile that lingered even after they disappeared into the snow. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them gathered inside by the fireplace. Lila was curled up against Daniel, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm, while the grandmother sat contentedly with her knitting. The warmth of the fire and the quiet hum of companionship filled the room. "Daniel," Lila said sleepily, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Can I call you Daddy?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and his chest swelled with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Finally he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that, Lila. Very much." Lila beamed before nestling closer, her eyes fluttering shut. The grandmother's eyes glistened, and she gave Daniel a knowing smile. For the first time, Daniel felt complete. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home filled with love, laughter, and the family he never knew he needed. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story, one that highlights the transformative power of love, kindness, and human connection. Stories like these remind us that the most significant changes in life often happen not through wealth or power but through compassion and the bonds we form with others. Daniel's journey from a lonely millionaire to a man who found his true purpose through helping others mirrors something we all crave: belonging. Lila and her grandmother symbolize resilience and the beauty of simple joys. Together, they found a new beginning, and Daniel found the meaning his life had been missing. We hope this story touched your heart and left you feeling inspired. Whether it's through small acts of kindness or a renewed appreciation for the people in your life, let this story encourage you to take a step toward something meaningful. Thank you for your support and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to have you as part of our growing community of readers and storytellers. Each week, we share heartfelt narratives that inspire, entertain, and remind us of the power of human connection. By subscribing to our channel, you won't miss any of the incredible stories we have in store. Hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need a reminder of the beauty of kindness and family. We also want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the story moved you the most? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment of kindness that changed someone's life? Let's keep the conversation going, one story at a time. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can create a community that celebrates the power of storytelling and connection. Thank you for being here. If you loved this story, stay tuned for our next narrative: a farmer's letter to his estranged son, a revelation that changed everything. This touching story follows a father and son who have been separated by years of misunderstanding. When the son returns to the family farm, he discovers a letter from his father that reveals a secret that will alter the course of their relationship forever. What drove them apart? And can they find their way back to each other before it's too late? This is a tale of reconciliation, hidden truths, and the enduring bond of family that you won't want to miss. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you'll be the first to hear this incredible story. Trust us, it's one that will stay with you long after the last word. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people you love. And remember, every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to create ripples that can transform lives.